All right, welcome back. As I mentioned, the next video lecture would be about cardiac output. And I mentioned to you to keep in mind that value 70 milliliters, the average amount of blood that is ejected out of the left ventricle and into the aorta with each heartbeat. That's an average value that occurs in an average adult. Keep in mind that that is going to vary from person to person. Like males in general are going to have a higher cardiac output on average than females. Endurance athletes are going to have a higher cardiac output than people who are sedentary. Older people are going to have a lower cardiac output due to reduced heart function compared to younger people. So we're always kind of thinking in terms of averages here. Now the CO, the cardiac output, what that literally, it's a number that's calculated, and it's the volume of blood that's pumped out of the ventricles in 1 minute. So how you calculate that is CO is your heart rate. Heart rate is beats per minute. That's your heart rate times your stroke volume. And your stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out by a ventricle with each beat. All right, and it's on average about 75 milliliters. So your cardiac output, you're going to say, how many times does the heart beat per minute? And each time it's beating, it's squirting out 75 milliliters of blood from a ventricle. And these numbers usually refer to the left ventricle. The right ventricle, they can be slightly different. And you combine those two together and you have your cardiac output. That's the volume of blood each minute that's being pumped out of the left ventricle. So here's a typical calculation. Heart rate, average 75 beats per minute, times a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat gives us an overall volume of 5.25 liters per minute. Okay, and so why is that? That's because 75 times 70 milliliters is 5,250 milliliters. A milliliter, or an ml, is 1/1000th of a liter. Okay, so if you take 5,250 and you divide that by 1,000, that's going to tell you how many liters of blood you're pumping out from the left ventricle each minute. And that's 5.25 liters per minute. Okay, now you think about it, that number is very similar to what we talked about over in chapter 17 as far as the volume, all of the volume of your blood in a typical adult. It's pretty close. So each minute, if you think about it, all of your blood on average is passing through the left ventricle each minute and getting pumped out. So this blood is flowing through your body very, very quickly. All right, now cardiac output can be altered. Your cardiac output needs to go up when you're exercising or engaged in some other type of vigorous activity. That makes sense. You've got to circulate blood faster to your tissues because they're going to be using more oxygen gas and more nutrients, and they're going to be generating more waste that have to be carted away. So your cardiac output needs to go up. When you're chilling, you're relaxing, you're sleeping, your cardiac output can go down because you're not as metabolically active. So your cells are not demanding as much oxygen gas and nutrients, and they're not generating waste quite as quickly. In a non-athletic person, your maximal cardiac output is about 4 to 5 times heavier than what it is, than what it is at rest. And so if you're exerting yourself, but you're a non-athletic person, that's about how high you can go. In a trained athlete, though, it can go up to about 35 liters per minute. So each minute you're circulating several times your whole blood volume through the heart, multiple times each minute. There's another value called cardiac reserve. That's the difference between your resting and your maximal cardiac output. That's called your cardiac reserve. How much higher can your cardiac output go when you're exerting yourself? If you're a trained athlete, your cardiac reserve is going to be higher. If you are sedentary, your cardiac reserve is going to be lower. If you have heart disease, and your heart just simply cannot function much stronger than it does when you're at rest, your cardiac reserve is going to be even lower. That makes sense when you think about it. You guys know that people, as they develop heart disease, and we all know people who have heart disease, they get out of breath doing the simplest things. Why are you out of breath? Because your lungs are desperately trying to take more oxygen gas in from the atmosphere to attach it to your hemoglobin, get more oxygen attached to your hemoglobin, because your heart is just not doing a very good job of pumping that blood around and circulating it to your tissues very quickly. So we got to load that hemoglobin up with as much oxygen as we can, so that your tissues are getting as much oxygen as they can with each of those wimpy heartbeats that you're making. Now, cardiac output is something that can be adjusted, obviously. And how do we change your cardiac output? All right, so cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. You multiply those two together, and that gives you this value. What's the volume of blood that you pump out of your left ventricle with each minute? So if you increase, hopefully this makes sense to you mathematically, if you increase either of those two things, if you increase your heart rate, your cardiac output is going to go up. If you increase your stroke volume, your cardiac output is going to go up. If either of those values or both are higher, your cardiac output will go up. Your cardiac output needs to go up when you're doing things like exercising. All right, now we've already said, well, the heart beats on its own. The SA node depolarizes automatically, and and that leads to a heart contraction. It doesn't need any input to tell it to do that. That's true, but your body does have ways of controlling your heart rate, speeding it up and slowing it down, which we'll talk about those various things. First, though, let's talk about how stroke volume can be controlled. That's one of those two things that can be adjusted to help change your overall cardiac output. All right, so stroke volume, again, that number is your end diastolic volume. All right, so that's the maximal volume in your ventricles after ventricular diastole. That's when that's taking place. Minus your end systolic volume. That's what you have in there. That's what's left after systole. Okay? The difference between those two, that's the amount of blood that you squirted out of the ventricle into either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. All right, so this SV can be affected, that value can be affected by three things, which we're going to talk about. One of these is called preload. One of them is called contractility, and that's how forcefully the ventricles are contracting, which makes sense. And then afterload, we'll talk about what that means as well. But you got three things that affect this. What do we mean by preload? Preload refers to how much blood volume is filling those ventricles before the ventricles actually contract. Okay, that's preload, and really more specifically, it's referring to how much the cardiac muscle cells get stretched before they contract, in your ventricles. That's what we're really referring to here. Your ventricular myocardium, the cardiac muscle fibers in that location. All right, so if you have more filling, more blood volume in your ventricles before the ventricles actually start to contract, that's going to physically stretch the walls of the ventricles. That makes sense. Now, the ventricles are not contracting yet, but those cells are like your skeletal muscle fibers. They can be extended, they can be compressed, they can be extended, they can be compressed, even when they're not contracting. They're squishy kind of cells, stretchy and squishy. All right, so if you think about it, thinking back to Biology 201, remember contraction force is generated by actin and myosin filaments that fill up the majority of the space in your muscle fibers, forming cross bridges, and then they slide across each other, and that's what leads to the force of contraction. So if you pre-stretch those cardiac muscle cells before the walls of the ventricles contract, Your actin and your myosins are going to be a little bit further separated like this. And so when they cross bridge like this, they have a greater amount of room to slide across each other. And so if they start off over here, because those cells are not all that stretched out, they come together, they may only be able to slide this far. If they're starting out over here because those cells are stretched, now they can slide that far across each other. And the farther they can slide, your actins and your myosins can slide across each other inside those cells. That's going to lead to a greater contraction force. All right, so and you learn that in Biology 201 when you study your skeletal muscle fibers as well. If they're stretched a little bit before contraction takes place, you can actually contract those muscles a little bit more strongly. Now, with regard to the heart, this is called the Frank-Starling law of the heart, which is something important to know. And again, it's just if you pre-stretch those cardiac muscle cells before they contract, they're going to be able to cross bridge and slide across the actins and the myosins. Will do more cross bridging and generate greater contraction force. Okay, what are some things that this is called preload, this stretch that takes place. What are some things that can increase the stretch of the ventricles? So we want to stretch them out before they start contracting. And it's your right ventricle and your left ventricle over here. If you have a slower heartbeat, if it takes longer, you have a longer gap between heartbeats, you're going to have more passive filling of your left ventricle and your right ventricle. Your AV valves are going to stay open longer and allow blood to flow by gravity into your right and your left ventricle. That's one thing. Exercising. If you're vigorously exercising, that's going to increase your blood pressure. That's going to increase the rate at which blood is flowing back to the heart. And that also is something that can increase your preload. So both of those things can lead to a stronger contraction of the ventricles. Stronger contraction leads to increased stroke volume. That should make sense. If the ventricles are contracting more forcefully, they're going to squeeze more blood up into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. All right, so that's one thing, that's preload. And see, that's something that's part of maintaining homeostasis. Your ventricles contract more forcefully when you're putting more demand on the body, like through exercise. You just naturally, that increased blood flow back to the heart is going to cause the ventricles to contract more forcefully so that you will increase your cardiac output to supply oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood to your tissues that need them. So that makes sense. All right, another thing that you can do is contractility is another thing that increases stroke volume, which we just mentioned. If you increase contraction force, you're going to increase your stroke volume. Okay, so preload can lead to increased contractility, but there are other things that can increase contractility as well, independent of any preload stretching. Okay, one of those things is any sort of increased calcium influx. Do you guys remember from Biology 201 when you study skeletal muscle fiber contraction? You have calcium ions are released from the SR, and those bind to troponin, which slides the tropomyosin off of the actin binding sites on the myosin heads, and the myosin binding sites on the actin, so that they can come together and form cross bridges. And you have a similar story like that takes place within your cardiac muscle fibers as well. The calcium comes in from the extracellular fluids as well. So anything that jacks up, increases calcium influx, is going to lead to more cross bridging and more contraction taking place in your cardiac muscle fibers. One of those things is sympathetic stimulation. So that's from your autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch, remember your fight or flight nervous system branch, one of the things that stimulates is increased heart rate, because if you're exercising or you're in a period of stress, I got to run away from a monster, I need my heart to beat faster and circulate, pump more blood out to all of my tissues, so they'll have greater access to oxygen gas and nutrients. There are hormones that can stimulate your muscle fibers to contract more forcefully. One of those is epinephrine, that we were just studying when we covered the nervous system. That is produced by the adrenal medulla, and that is one of those fight or flight hormones that we learned about. So along with your sympathetic nervous system, that makes sense that would stimulate more forceful heart contractions. Thyroxine, your thyroxine, thyroid hormone, jacks up metabolism. So if we kind of think through this logically, if your metabolism is going up, what do your cells need more of? O2, glucose, all that good stuff. So they're also going to have their wastes taken away more quickly. So that makes sense that thyroxine would increase the contractility of your cardiac muscle cells, so your heart beats more forcefully, and that increases your cardiac output. Glucagon, glucagon triggers release of glucose from your liver to help supply your cells with the glucose that they need. So it makes sense. You want to contract your heart more forcefully and increase your cardiac output, so you're circulating that glucose around the body. So when you kind of start putting some of these things together, in physiology, it makes sense. What are some things that decrease contractility? Acidosis. What's acidosis? That's where your pH is below the normal homeostatic range. Hopefully you remember that's 735 to 745. So below that, you're in a state of acidosis, and that will interfere with the contractility of your cardiac muscle fibers. Too much extracellular potassium ions. If you guys remember, you're supposed to have a greater concentration of potassium ions in your intracellular fluids as opposed to extracellular fluids, and that difference is critical for action potentials. The movement of those ions across the cell membrane is critical for that. So if you have too much in your extracellular fluids, that's going to screw up your ability to generate action potentials properly. That's why injection of inappropriate amounts of potassium, like in an IV fluid, can be fatal. That's actually what it's kind of morbid to think about, but that's what they use when they do executions by lethal injections. They give the people who are being executed potassium to stop the heart. Calcium channel blockers. All right, so you got calcium channels sitting in the membranes of your cardiac muscle fibers. Calcium has to come in for a couple of things. It's involved in generating the action potentials, the electrical signals around the surfaces of your cardiac muscle cells, but then it's also involved in stimulating the cross-bridging between the actins and the myosins. Calcium channel blockers, these are a type of drugs, and these are drugs that are used to reduce cardiac output. Yes, there are times when you want to reduce your cardiac output, because cardiac output affects your blood pressure. If you're squeezing out too much blood out of the left ventricle and into the aorta with each heartbeat, you're going to have too much blood pressing up against the walls of your aorta, and then consequently all of the arteries that are downstream from the aorta, they're going to have too much blood in them with each heartbeat. The more blood that's pressing up against the walls of those arteries, that's going to increase your blood pressure. So calcium channel blockers are drugs that some people take to help reduce their cardiac output, and hence their blood pressure. Another thing that regulates your stroke volume, the third thing, is called afterload. Afterload is referring to the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta that has to be overcome in order for the ventricles to be able to squeeze blood up into those vessels. And generally when you talk about this, it's really the aorta that's the one of the most concern. This one over here, this is your aorta, because your pressure is going to be quite a bit greater in there than it is over in the pulmonary trunk, which is taking blood out to the lungs. All right, so if we think about this, all right, so your ventricles have to contract forcefully and force blood through the aortic semilunar valve and up into the aorta. So those semilunar valve cusps are not going to open up until your pressure in the walls of the left ventricle is greater than the pressure in the wall of the aorta. So think about like if you had your hand wrapped around an aorta and you were squeezing on that, keeping the pressure high, and using that force to go against the left ventricle over there. Eventually the ventricle would contract enough to force the blood up into the aorta anyway. So you've got these competing pressures that are taking place between the aorta and the left ventricle. So that's called afterload. What's the pressure in the aorta that the left ventricle has to compete against to eject that blood up in there and force the aortic semilunar valve open? So anything that increases afterload, will decrease your cardiac output. Okay, so if you have a higher pressure in the aorta, it's going to take more contraction force by the ventricle before the aortic semilunar valve is going to open and allow blood to pass in there. That's going to decrease your cardiac output. Less blood is going to be pumped out of the left ventricle. So that winds up decreasing your stroke volume. You have a greater ESV, in systolic volume, which means you have more blood left over in the ventricles after they contract. Hypertension, high blood pressure. If you have that, then your aortic pressure is going to be higher, and that is going to increase your afterload. That is going to decrease your cardiac output. Okay, so be sure when you're reviewing, we've got some more difficult physiology concepts here with the heart that we're talking about, but be sure you understand preload and contractility and afterload and why they impact. Think your way through it. Think through it logically and why those things impact your cardiac output. Do they increase it or do they decrease it, and why? All right, lecture number 12. All right, so cardiac output is affected by those three things, and we're going to see how the ANS, your autonomic nervous system, the involuntary branch of your nervous system, and hormones actually control this cardiac output. They influence those things that we've been talking about. So that'll be the topic for lecture number 12.